Henry VI is widely regarded as the weakest king in English history. Dan Jones even described him as the most useless monarch. Under his reign, the Wars of the Roses erupted, ultimately toppling him from the throne, claiming his life and the lives of over 100,000 of his subjects, and bringing about the end of the Plantagenet dynasty. Henry Tudor, viewing himself as the rightful successor to his half-uncle, ascended the throne. Yet, alongside his wife, Elizabeth of York, he established a new dynasty, one whose name still echoes through history today. This naturally raises a crucial question. What went wrong with Henry VI? His father, Henry V, is celebrated as England's great warrior king. Welcome back to Lemmy History. Henry VI has long fascinated me. He embodied many virtues that are typically seen in a positive light. He was a patron of education, he showed mercy, and he shared his wealth generously. Yet, as his contemporaries believed, it was precisely these last two traits that led to catastrophe. Let's begin with the most obvious explanation. Henry VI likely inherited a mental illness from his mother's lineage. I've made a separate video detailing his grandfather's health issues, which you'll find linked in the description. You'll also find a link to my video on the death of Henry V. However, attributing everything to mental illness risks overlooking other significant factors. One key issue is clear. Henry ascended the throne as an infant. Yet, here I have to disagree with Dan Jones, who writes, "From the very day that England learned of Henry V's death, there was an astonishingly sophisticated and united effort by virtually the entire English political community to operate the young king's power responsibly and carefully on his behalf." As we'll see, this was far from the reality. Realistically, Henry VI never had a real chance of being seen as a successful king. The expectations placed upon him were impossible to fulfill. He was supposed to be a continuation of his father's reign, a king who could maintain the union of the English and French crowns. Simply put, the English did not want King Henry VI, they wanted Henry V. Even under his father's direct guidance, living up to this expectation would have been nearly impossible, but Henry had to navigate this immense burden without the man he was meant to replace. Moreover, he and his advisors faced an unprecedented challenge. No one had ever ruled as king of both England and France before. There was no model to follow. This uncertainty extended beyond Henry's claim to the throne. Even the political protocol was unclear. When he was crowned King of France on December 16, 1431, on a bitterly cold winter's day in Notre Dame Cathedral, his great-uncle, Cardinal Henry Beaufort, performed the ceremony. This infuriated the French, who had expected a French bishop to oversee the coronation, an easily avoidable blunder. Another misstep followed when the 10-year-old Henry failed to grant the customary pardons expected of a French monarch. Meanwhile, war still raged in France to enforce Henry's claim, and the Scottish border remained dangerously unstable. Yet Henry, too young and uninterested in military matters, could offer no real leadership. He sought peace, but peace was impossible when the other side refused to accept it. In short, a little boy was tasked with the impossible. Catastrophic news arrived regularly, and Henry had no one to teach him how to handle it as a king. In theory, Henry's uncles should have been the ones to resolve these issues. John, Duke of Bedford, oversaw France, while Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, managed affairs in England. However, Gloucester's character flaws were widely recognized by his contemporaries, leading the Privy Council to appoint Bedford as Regent of England whenever he was in the country. Meanwhile, Cardinal Beaufort and his faction, excluded from Henry V's original succession plan, exerted significant influence, particularly over the young king, who held the churchmen in high regard. Adding to this dynamic was the Earl of Warwick, Henry's tutor, who frequently clashed with the king. As Henry grew older, William de la Pole steadily rose in favour, eventually becoming Duke of Suffolk and one of Henry's most trusted advisors. Ideally, these men should have worked together in the Privy Council for the good of the realm. Gloucester, however, had little interest in cooperation. He launched an unauthorised military campaign on the continent, providing the Duke of Burgundy with a convenient excuse to abandon the English and defect to the French. Though Burgundy did not immediately switch sides, his decision was likely sealed at that moment. The loss was devastating. Philip of Burgundy was the only man Henry VI ever publicly declared he wanted to fight, a testament to how deeply the defection of his father's key ally shook England. Yet the greater concern for the English was the deteriorating relationship between Henry's two uncles. Detailed records from the Privy Council give us striking insights into this growing rift. One example, which I have modernized, illustrates Gloucester's defiant attitude and why I disagree with Dan Jones. My Lord of Gloucester spoke and answered, as he had done at various times before. If I have done anything concerning the kingdom of my sovereign lord, I will not be accountable to any man except the king himself when he is of age. And besides, my brother shall reign as he pleases as long as he is in this country, for as soon as he leaves for France, I will do as I see fit. Gloucester felt accountable to no one, not even the king, while he was still a minor. And worse, he got away with it. By acting in his own interests, he not only undermined royal authority, but also weakened the stability of the crown, and no one stopped him. In reality, the situation was even more dire. Henry's uncles, great-uncle and Warwick, regularly filled his household with their own allies, ensuring control over the king. Henry had no siblings, few stable caregivers at court, and minimal contact with children his own age. His closest companion was the heir of a foreign prince, held in England as a political hostage to manipulate his father. Henry was profoundly lonely. He lacked a consistent circle of confidence and never learned whom he could or couldn't trust. Warwick focused on theoretical education. Henry, for instance, spoke fluent French and found solace in prayer. But his retreat into religion was not necessarily due to his personality or mental health. It was simply the product of his circumstances. As an adolescent, Henry VI repeatedly attempted to break free from his isolation and assert himself as an independent ruler. Each time, his efforts were met with the worst possible response. Warwick, for instance, was granted permission by the Privy Council to remove individuals from the king's entourage whom he deemed to be a bad influence. The Privy Council itself reminded Henry that he was still too young to make independent decisions, warning him that such actions could be legally dangerous or harmful to his rule and his realm. Whenever the young king tried to prove himself, or even simply form friendships, he was met with resistance. Warwick was even given the authority to reprimand him. With each passing day, Henry's position grew more precarious, especially after Bedford's death. The king was willing to learn and engage in governance, yet he was met only with rejection and humiliation. It is true that Henry, as a 10-year-old, was incapable of handling the immense responsibilities of kingship. And many still remembered the disastrous reign of Richard II, who had been allowed to rule in his own name as a teenager. However, the approach taken with Henry was entirely counterproductive. His situation underscored just how devastating the early loss of his father had been. Traditionally, the heir to the throne was sent to Wales to gain practical experience in governance, but Henry had no role models, no preparation, and was denied this crucial learning period. Predictably, over time, the regents found themselves overwhelmed by mounting problems and internal conflicts. Eventually, they resolved to grant Henry full authority at the age of 14. Just months earlier, he had been told he was still incapable of ruling independently. Yet even as he assumed power, distrust in the king had not disappeared. In theory, he should have led an army to France immediately, but no one believed that was a good idea. Henry himself was not even consulted. His authority was publicly undermined from the very start of his reign. Henry VI faced far too many crises at once, some of which he created himself. His excessive generosity was a major issue. He handed out gifts of money and land that the crown simply could not afford, plunging public finances deep into the red. The situation became so dire that Henry struggled to find anyone willing to lend him money. Worse still, he repeatedly granted positions and titles twice, acting so hastily and generously that he often failed to consult his advisors, who might have prevented such costly mistakes. Militarily, the situation deteriorated further. The French decisively defeated the English in battle after battle, making England's position look increasingly hopeless. In an attempt to turn the tide, Henry placed his trust in Edmund Beaufort, offending Richard, Duke of York, in the process. The outcome was one of the worst defeats in English history. Another looming issue was the matter of succession. For years, Henry remained childless, leaving his uncle Humphrey as his heir. This became even more complicated when Humphrey's wife, Eleanor Cobham, had an astrologer predict the king's death, an act considered high treason. She was sentenced to a humiliating public penitential walk before being imprisoned for life, and her marriage to Humphrey was annulled. Yet Humphrey spent the rest of his life campaigning for her release and their remarriage, and remarkably, no one put a stop to his demands. Henry's own mother, Catherine of Valois, had secretly married a Welshman, Owen Tudor, after being prevented by Parliament from marrying her original choice, Edmund Beaufort. Tudor was imprisoned, but managed to escape, likely with Henry's knowledge and assistance. The couple had several children, and rumors circulated that Edmund Tudor was actually the son of Edmund Beaufort. Despite the scandal, Henry embraced his half-siblings warmly. He was especially delighted to finally have a family of his own. Edmund Tudor would later marry Margaret, a niece of Edmund Beaufort. Together, they had a son named after the king, Henry Tudor, the very figure mentioned at the beginning. Too many fires raged around the young king, and while some extinguished themselves, his mother's death, for instance, put an end to that particular scandal, far too many remained. Worse, the problems Henry failed to address only gave rise to new ones. The economic crisis, for example, soon triggered widespread uprisings. Henry VI held ideals that were entirely unsuited to his time. His father had been the great warrior king, yet Henry sought to be remembered as the king of peace. To achieve this, he took extraordinary risks. He released a high-ranking prisoner and ceded valuable territory to the French in exchange for a mere 18-month truce. His marriage to Margaret of Anjou, a niece of the French king, was meant to cement a lasting peace, but it failed. In fact, the ceasefire did not even hold for the full 18 months. At home, Henry devoted himself to education and religion, the only two areas he had been allowed to engage with during his upbringing. He founded institutions such as King's College in Cambridge and Eton College, expanded various schools, and even had ambitious plans to extend Westminster Abbey. But England was descending into anarchy. Noble factions fought bitterly over lands that Henry had carelessly granted to multiple claimants. His well-intentioned cultural and religious projects did nothing to address the escalating chaos. Henry cared deeply about the salvation of his people, but paid little attention to their worldly well-being. In the end, he became more of a priest for England than its king. In the end, Henry found himself trapped in a vicious cycle from which there was no escape. Unattainable expectations, a lack of self-confidence, inadequate education, warring relatives, a lack of role models, and an ever-growing list of crises created a perfect storm. And as mentioned, he had also likely inherited a mental illness. It was hardly surprising that a lonely king would retreat into the few things he truly understood. Henry VI was probably the weakest monarch England has ever had. He was, without question, the wrong king for his time. Yet it is easy to forget that he was also a product of his era. Despite his shortcomings, Henry took a keen interest in questions of kingship and genuinely wanted what was best for his country. But at every turn, he was met with resistance and hostility. His reign was not just a failure of one man, it was a failure of England's political elite as well. Thanks for watching. As always, please like and subscribe.